Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Conrad Wadowski with us. Conrad, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Bronson.
Yeah, we
Appreciate
had your partner on as actually the second episode, Matan Griffel.
it.
I remember doing his interview and having no clue what I was doing.
Yep.
So now you're up in the 80s somewhere, episode 80 something. So hopefully this one will be even better than his.
That's great. That's great. No, I'm looking forward to it, and yeah, this is great.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you are a partner, like I said, with Matan at GrowHack,
Yep.
and you call it the world's first growth hacking agency. So we have to talk about that. It's Growth Hacker TV. You run the first growth hacking agency.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about GrowHack. When did it begin?
Sure. So, GrowHack began about a year ago, and in a sense, though, I almost think of GrowHack beginning even earlier than that. I mean, I was doing this growth stuff earlier, and didn't really have like a specific definition for it. I didn't really know exactly what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
At first, it's actually I thought of it as almost being like a generalist, and I'm doing all these different things.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional way you think about I think careers is you specialize. And so I ended up sort of doing this consulting work for a couple different or a couple different startups. Matan was doing the same thing. And so we said, well, we started talking about it, and we said, well, why don't we just kind of combine forces, and why don't we, start just doing this together?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how GrowHack came together. Both of us combining forces, both of us saying that, we're doing similar stuff, so why not share some of it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it worked out in some ways, and I think that there's a lot of potential for it.
No, that's great. Well, let me ask you this. What would be the main difference between how, let's say, a traditional marketing agency might approach a startup as opposed to how GrowHack would approach a startup? Because I think that'll really delineate what it is you do that's
Sure.
unique and special.
Sure. I think agencies focus on so large, full service agencies will focus, in which there's a lot of in New York. Focus on creating awareness and on being able to allocate lots of money. Um,
Yeah.
I think for a startup, it's kind of the opposite in both senses. One, you don't want to generate a lot of awareness. You want to convert. You want to whether it's turning someone into a user or to monetize someone immediately. That's kind of what you're focused on, not that early stage in the funnel, part of the funnel where you're just getting the word out. The other side is that you don't have any money to allocate. So I think that what we do is focused on how you can actually how you can within your product convert a user, and then how do you do that for a very, very low cost, and potentially how do you create an engine to kind of do that?
Yeah. You mentioned the word funnel already. And,
Sure.
when you say, a traditional marketing agency is going to bring awareness, I think to myself, like, that's even like pre-funnel. Like, I don't even know where that fits in, like awareness. It's like I deal with funnels so much that when you
Yeah.
say it, I try to figure out, well, is that the acquisition? Is that where are we at? And then it's like, no, that's nowhere. That's just they've heard of something sort of familiar with you,
That's exactly it. You're not as a startup. You don't have time to think about awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you need the conversion.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, then you kind of have to rethink what you're doing.
Yeah, so let me ask you this. What kind of companies do you work with? Are they just startups? Or do you work with other brands that maybe they're not startups, but they get it? Like they know that awareness is not always the answer.
Yep.
I'm just interested personally in what kind of companies come to you.
Sure, it is a mix. So I think the general focus for like the Grow Hack model is seed and Series A funded companies. I think that companies that are earlier don't have the resources, or maybe are trying to bring in growth a little bit too early.
Mm-hmm.
I think that companies beyond the Series A stage are looking to hire somebody full time. And so, the way that our model works is that I'm able to work with multiple companies, sort of a portfolio of companies in a sense. And the best way to do that is to focus on that particular stage. There are larger companies that are interested in all of these different tactics and different ways of thinking about growth.
Mm-hmm.
so we've been talking to a lot of big companies about it, working with them, and figuring out ways they can better use some of these tactics and best practices for user growth.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go too into the bigger company side, but I think that there's a lot of interest, and it's still a little bit early stage in figuring out what are the ways they can use it.
Yeah.
One maybe kind of quick point to put in is that I think what growth I think comes down to like a process. So the first step of the process is generating a hypothesis, and then the second step is testing out that hypothesis. So I think a big company oftentimes is looking for help on that first step. How do I generate the best types of hypotheses? So I think that they're very interested in that. I think that they're curious about how you can use some of these startups to do it.
Yeah, I think growth hacking in general, it's going to become more and more mainstream in bigger corporations. But you're right, I don't think it's there yet. I think startups are still trying to figure it out, and they're still trying to get their head around it. But I mean, fast forward 5 years, and I wouldn't doubt that Procter and Gamble is going to have a growth hacking team really worried about more than awareness and commercials, and worried about actually driving people through the funnel online and maybe even other ways as well. So it'll get there. I agree, but it's not there yet. That's for sure.
That's a great point too. We do some workshops out here in New York, and one of the things that we do is we take some of these large companies and we just take their landing page, their homepage, and we just kind of rip it apart. If you showed any of these homepages to anybody that's on a growth team somewhere, they're just gonna think they're just gonna see so many different problems with it. They're not focused. They don't really have an objective. It's someone that sort of developed the website but didn't think about the conversion side of the website.
Yeah,
it's the common problem that startups get, which is overbuilding features and just links everywhere. Whereas potentially, and I think it's true that a larger company could focus their calls to action a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, is it fair to say that maybe they do their websites with the same kind of awareness mentality they do their commercials with? So you go to their homepage and it's like, hey, here's a charity we give to. Hey, here's a note from our CEO. Hey, here's 4 new products that came out last week. And then you look at it and you don't know what to do with any of it because it's half corporate, half consumer. It's a little bit of messaging, a little bit of, legalese. It's just like, what do I click? I don't know, pick something. There's no funnel.
And that's where you lose somebody. You lose somebody in those first couple of seconds. You might have someone so motivated they want to order flowers from 1-800-Flowers through the website. But many times someone's going to land on the website and they're going to be like, oh, there's all this stuff here. You know what? I'll just do this later. and then what happens is that they're like, all right, well, let me just buy the flowers for my girlfriend on the way home from the local bodega. And then you lose a sale. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point to think about. Are these big companies at some point going to have growth teams? Oh.
Yeah, it seems like a growth hacker is all about focus, where marketing is all about almost a broad lack of focus by definition. Not that it's good or bad; it's just very different. Because you think about the homepage we're talking about. Growth hackers focus the homepage. You think about marketing in general. Growth hackers focus on conversions, not awareness and brand building and reputation and things like that. So almost at every stage, take a marketer, chop it down and focus it, and you're left with a growth hacker in some senses.
Yeah, but I think that these larger companies maybe are incorrectly thinking about their website. I think awareness is great. I think that they can create awareness. For example, allocating funds into a large budget and doing ads. That's fine. But once somebody gets to the page, what can you do to convert them? The principles are pretty similar. Yeah. What can you do to get somebody to take action? Otherwise you'll have a startup that's a 1-800-Flowers knockoff that's going to be getting those conversions without even creating the awareness.
Yeah.
So I think that's a way to think about it. Yeah.
Well, no, I think that's one of the reasons why that this whole kind of mentality has, risen to prominence in some circles, is because it allows you to compete just because you're actually converting people when they hit your site. You don't have near the traffic, but you're converting it at such a higher rate that you're able to compete in a way that's kind of absurd.
Exactly. It's exactly it.
Yeah.
If you can, your conversion rate is probably like if you're a flower startup, and you're converting really well. So let's say getting someone through the funnel at like a 10% or something. That's probably 10 times what 1-800-Flowers is doing.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to think about the two kind of worlds. And so let's talk about some of the successes that you've had with GrowHack. You've had a number of different clients. I don't know if you can give their names or not. You may not be able to. But tell us some of the successes you've had with clients, and even more so maybe what you did or some of the big pieces that were off that you really put in place that helped them.
Yeah. So, so for some clients, an NDA is there. And so some of the conversations, I would love to have, but I can't. But one example is, and I'm just going to kind of not talk about the name, is, one company that was trying to improve conversions from their homepage to signing up, to having an actual sign-up user. The consulting process is always interesting because I think there's also a healthy skepticism from anybody, for someone to come in and to start to make these sort of potentially big changes to their site. They've thought about their site. They believe they're experts in their customer and in the way that they can convert the customer. So even if they're looking for help, they're still a little bit hesitant. So with this particular client, and that maybe just as a general point of advice, if this someone is doing consulting, start with a small project and then show really, really good results. So in this case, the first project that we did for them was using Optimizely, so taking a snippet of JavaScript code, putting it into their homepage, and simplifying their sign-up process. Making sure that it's very easy to, once you're at the homepage, to sign up. Before, the site had 14 different fields to fill out. 14 different fields, and then like that's not even counting like the checkboxes. Like there's like multiple checkboxes, and then the button to go to the next step is like tiny, and it's the same color as like the rest of the page. Looks nice maybe, but the user doesn't really know what to do. It's a lot of friction that you're asking for somebody. On top of that, they had all this text explaining, talking about how great their product is. And someone the way that we process the web is we're just if you've ever like seen somebody or just observed somebody on the web, they're kind of like this in this ADD state. They're they're clicking, and you need to get very quickly to the point. There's a lot of competing interests. There's a lot of links to get someone out. So one, reducing the amount of text, simply reducing the number of fields, improve their conversion about 400 or 500%.
Awesome.
This all very kind of quick changes that I could have done, all A/B tested. And something that built a lot of trust with the clients. At this point, we've done a series of other tests, completely redid the homepage, redid the entire flow. Now they're converting on the homepage to new users at about over 1,500% compared to the beginning. It was a low rate to begin with, but
still quite an increase though. That's great.
Still a big increase.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said, which may be the takeaway of this episode already, is when people are on the internet, they have ADD. They are riddled with ADD. And if you just keep that in mind with every stage of the funnel, every bit of copywriting, every video you put in front of them, like if you just keep that in mind with everything, then it's going to make every conversion rate go up. I mean, I don't see how it couldn't.
That's exactly it. Understand your user, right? In person, the pitch that you're making to someone is going to be very different potentially. You might use similar words, but the way that it's set up is going to be different. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. Now you have an upcoming workshop where you're actually going to be teaching about user acquisition and growth hacking for startups. And I saw this online. I thought, all right, Conrad has to walk us through this because it's going to be perfect. And that's why I'm not going too much into what you've done for your clients, because my guess is you're teaching it through this course, and we'll talk about it a little bit now. But you have like 4 or 5 steps here, kind of the main sections you're going to be teaching. And it starts with implementing the growth hacking funnel. Talk to us about that. What is the growth hacking funnel, and how do you implement it?
Yeah, so as far as so the naming, we've kind of changed the naming from the growth hacking funnel to the lean marketing funnel, and the idea with that is I think that a lot of people don't have a lot of startups don't have a framework of thinking about what's the priority for them. Marketing is often someone running around with their head cut off kind of feeling, and they're not sure. There's so many things you could be doing, and how do you prioritize that? So what the lean marketing funnel is it's basically taken a lot from our metrics from Dave McClure,
as we all do,
and acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. And thinking about taking that framework, putting it into the image of a funnel, and then having a startup think through their business or their business idea through that perspective. I think it's also, at the end of the day, a good communication tool too. I think there's kind of best practices almost just using the broader concepts of the funnel that a lot of startups make, and so it's easier to communicate those different points if you have that funnel in place.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word framework, and frameworks can just unlock so much potential because the things you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off doing, they might actually have a place in the funnel, and they'll be a lot more effective if you know where they're in the funnel and why you're doing them. And the funnel helps you prioritize. You're doing the wrong thing because you don't see the funnel in your mind as you go about your job, as you go about your task. So there's something about R, or the funnel, the lean marketing funnel you're talking about, that just, it makes sense of a very, very complicated world of marketing for startups.
Exactly. Ideally, you'd have the resources to have one person at each part of the funnel. If you look at growth teams at a lot of companies right now, they'll have somebody focused on acquisition, somebody on retention, somebody on activation, somebody on referral, maybe multiple people on different parts of referral. And so, when you're a startup, you're limited on those resources. So you find the place in the funnel that you can make the most impact, and then focus just all of your effort on that, and then move on to the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next thing you have is kind of a section here is to build viral feedback loops. Now, viral is the word we all kind of go to when we think about growth hacking. But what do you mean build viral feedback loops?
As just a general point, I think that virality is something that a lot of startups or people getting into startups think about when they probably shouldn't. One of the first things that I do with somebody, or I think a startup should just do, is focus on those other parts of the funnel beyond virality first. Virality at the end of the day is a form of acquisition. You're getting your users to bring in other users into the top of the funnel. So if you have a weak funnel, virality is not going to have the same effect. You might as well just, it becomes pretty difficult. I think that, so that's the first point, just to get that out of the way.
Yeah.
There is things that you can do with virality. I think one of the points to start with is maybe thinking about the selfish reasons that someone can invite somebody else into a system.
Okay.
So, I think a lot of people, for example, think that, someone lands on your homepage, they're going to want to share it. I think it happens.
Best case scenario.
Best case scenario, but it's you tend to share because you want to brag about something. And so thinking about those motivations and the motivations that I think are the most significant are ones that you don't think about too much with the web. So one of them is sex. So I think not overtly, but I think sex is a big motivator for just people in general. Status, recognition, stuff, money, influence. I think those motivations can be built into a system, and they could be built in a way to get you to spread the word about something. So the one side of it is, can you do something to motivate somebody to share something with somebody else? And then the other side is make it really easy to do that. So some of the free sort of viral channels that we kind of talk about are APIs, kind of integrating an API into your product. Phone contact address books, something a lot of startups mobile startups are looking into right now. Importing webmail email addresses, something that LinkedIn did pretty well before. Every user doesn't have to invite a whole bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
It could just be 2% of users, but those 2% will invite a ton of other people in.
Yeah.
Another thing that's kind of not appreciated too much is just contact files from customers. So just thinking about how the users that you have with your particular product can invite anybody else into the system.
Mm-hmm.
The ones I just mentioned are pretty common, but maybe there's some other ones that just your product itself is going to be good for. I think of kind of like for example, a B2B startup like Yammer.
Mm-hmm.
When you're first signing up for Yammer, you sign up with your business account, and then it's a lot easier for somebody to figure out how to invite other people into the system, or how the startup to figure out how to invite other people into the system. Mm-hmm. Whether it's maybe even reaching out to somebody, or maybe it's requesting that information from a particular company in a certain way.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I want to go back to something you said, at the very beginning when we started talking about virality. You said virality is just a form of customer acquisition. Yeah. And I want to say that again because virality gets so much hype and so much attention, and it becomes the heart, the engine, it dominates our focus, when really it's just a channel of customer acquisition. Nothing more, nothing less. There's nothing special or magical. It has the ability to be free sometimes and very impactful when done right in the right context. But it's just customer acquisition. So it's still about pouring people in the top of the funnel and making sure the rest of the funnel works, or virality is just going to leak out the bottom like everything else. Yes,
exactly. And virality becomes just another funnel for you to focus on. It's just a priority, a mixing of priorities. Kind of back again to that. It's probably better to focus on the other parts of your product that are not acquisition based, so the non referral based and the non acquisition based first. Get that down, and then start to think about, all right, what are some ideas what are some channels, what are some motivations that I can take advantage of to do this virality.
When do you know you're ready to focus on acquisition? Because it's a hard question I have to kind of deal with on my own. Is my funnel solid enough yet? Like, how do I know? When do I go back to the top and really dump into it? What are some rule of thumbs that you guys use there?
Yeah, I think a rule of thumb that I really like is, and I think this applies. It's tough because you can't really, say there's one metric out there that applies to every startup.
Sure.
But if I were to pick one, it would be day one retention. I think if you have a solid D1, you know that there's something interesting in your product. So as an example of like what is a good day one retention.
Well, so something also define day one retention for us as well, just so we're clear.
Sure. So day one retention, depending on, so if it's a mobile app, day one retention is somebody downloading your app, the next day coming back to the application and opening it.
Okay.
That's with a web app, it's not someone coming to the site and coming back the next day. It's someone signing up for your site, experience the core value of your product, and then coming back the next day.
Okay. Which might take them many weeks to get to that point, but then they come back the next day once they have the aha moment.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the idea is that the aha moment was good enough to have brought them back the next day.
And until they have that, you're not worried about it because they haven't really experienced it yet anyway.
Exactly. At that point, you might as well just be, maybe you're a content product. If you're a media company, that's fine. That's great. But if you're a startup, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, okay, that's great. Yeah. So once you kind of have the day one retention up, then that's when you focus on it. Are there any numbers in your mind of like what percentage should the D1 be? Yeah, totally.
So I think if you're at about a 12 to 15%, you're okay. You're not doing too well. You should consider potentially dropping what you're doing in the approach.
So this is when you consider giving up.
you might want to. So if you're below 12%, definitely change. If you're like 12 to 15, start to consider like what are some big changes you can do. If you're at about 20%, you're at a decent day one retention. There's something that you're doing well. But you ideally want to optimize that. I think 20% is where you get to the point where, all right, there's some product value here. Gotcha. Once you're at like 25%, 30%, you're onto something. If you get to let's say 50, 60% plus, then you're doing a really good job. So it's a it's a little bit of a sensitive question because there's one side of it which is determining if a certain number of people are coming back to the site, which through metrics and understanding it through metrics. But the other side of it is also the qualitative side. So what are people saying about the product and the experience? I think that if the product didn't exist, would you be very disappointed? Asking that type of a question will just give you a lot of information. Whether you're at that stage where you can kind of go to these other parts of the funnel and start to prioritize those.
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. Seeing it as kind of like 12% up to 50, 60%. Because essentially, if only 12% of people want to have the experience that's supposed to be the magical experience the day after they experienced it, something's wrong. Because it just means it wasn't that magical. They just didn't care that much. But once we get up to 20, 25, 30%, a third of the people that experienced it want to re-experience it, which means now you have something that you can build a product on that's meaningful. And now it's worth going and looking at viral loops and customer acquisition and all that, because a third of the people or a fourth of the people want to experience it again. So now you're not wasting your energy pouring water into the top of the funnel.
Exactly, because your funnel's leaky and it's not. It's better to focus on these other areas.
Yeah.
Right.
And now one of the other sections you talk about in this class is to plan and execute rigorous A/B tests. I know earlier you mentioned using Optimizely with one of your clients, and you simplified the registration flow, and it went up by many hundreds of percent, that kind of thing. Is there anything more to it than that you teach, or is it just simply do A/B test?
I think just do the A/B test. Yeah. I think it's as simple as that. You don't need multivariate. You don't need something even more sophisticated than that. Get 100 people on the A and the B test, or maybe even get 30 people on the A and the B test. I think that's your confidence interval is not going to be perfect, but I think you're going to get some good information. So yeah, I think Optimizely is a great way to start that. You can also do you can also build a system to do some of the A/B testing as well. So a lot of startups do that as well. So if you're doing feature A/B testing, you can do that. In general, the earlier stages of a company, A/B testing is a little difficult. So you want to get a lot of qualitative feedback on your approach first, and then start to get into the quantitative side.
Just because you don't have a lot of the quantitative yet.
Yeah, exactly.
The numbers aren't there to really learn from. Because early on in a startup, if you have one traffic source that's a big traffic source, they could dominate the entire analytics platform for a while, when really it's just a reflection of somebody else's users, not your own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you got to go off the qualitative a little bit more. So after the A/B test, you also talk about identifying your most valuable marketing channels. What do you mean by that?
So I think it comes down to figuring out for your particular where do your customers hang out. And there's a lot of common places. For entrepreneurs, for example, one place is Quora. Just finding people in general. Craigslist. A lot of people use Craigslist. And it's thinking about, so it's taking all of the ideas, even like the ideas that are kind of crappy, just put all of them down onto a list. Once you have them down on a list, think about each of those channels in terms of the cost and the conversion. Later on, you're also, when you're thinking about sort of like the growth engine for the business, you're going to think a lot about volume. At first, you just want some users to be coming in so that you can kind of better optimize your product. So thinking about all those channels and in terms of how well do they convert with your particular product, can you get some initial users from them? There's a lot of creative ways to do it. For Quora, and sometimes it's pretty obvious what you should do. But it's about first prioritizing them just logically, saying, hey, I think that this channel is probably going to convert a lot better than this one. Then it's testing each of those different channels and saying, okay, well, I'm not sure if Quora is converting better than Craigslist. Let's try these things out and let's see how many people are actually coming through the funnel and being monetized or becoming engaged users.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because you really just want to double down on what's working at the end of the day. And you mentioned there, at first it's not about the volume, but eventually it will be. But again, it goes back to what's your D1 retention, and now let's focus on volume. But one thing to maybe keep in mind at this point is not to worry about a channel too much if it can never bring you the volume you want. because some channels just have a limit on what you can do with them. So it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you optimize them and make them awesome. They
Yeah.
still only bring you 5 new users a day. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and and a point maybe to put in there is that how you almost want to make investments a little bit in channels potentially. So let's say that there is let's say you're looking at Facebook early days.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook in the early days had a lot of users, but maybe there was other places you could find users. But it was growing very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And you make the investment in a particular channel, and you say, look, I think that I'm going to take a bet that this channel is going to get even bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, those channels that are growing very quickly oftentimes have opportunities that a lot of people haven't seen yet, and so they haven't been, so like as an example, Zynga early days, going back to Facebook, Zynga early days with Facebook, Zynga took advantage of Facebook at when it wasn't saturated with a lot of people competing and racking up the price of what it takes to do advertising. And so you can take advantage of one of these kind of fast-growing distribution channels on the web, and potentially that can be your engine for growth.
Yeah.
So you can be kind of creative about what is a channel exactly. Meetup.com could be a channel. If you're a B2B company and you're trying to get clients, maybe put on an event for a client. If you can bring a whole bunch of customers in your room and just close one of them, that's a pretty good event.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually use Meetup as one of our customer acquisition channels for Growth Hacker TV. I go and find people that have technology-centric meetups, and I develop some kind of low-level partnership, and I say, look, I want to give everyone in your group a free month. Here's the promo code, and now I got somebody marketing to a couple hundred people for me on my behalf. I mean, it's one of those things, and I can do it repeatedly over and over, and there's a whole lot of meetups around the world, and that's just one little channel that a lot of people ignore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And when somebody's ignoring it, that's when there's the opportunity. So, I don't know if in a couple of years from now, it's going to be the same way. Maybe it's going to have changed a little bit. So
yeah, it probably will, but I'll be on to the next thing.
yeah, exactly. Or maybe Meetup might have changed the way that their channel is set up. Facebook at first, Facebook's constantly making these changes, and so if you can sort of see the change happen and then take advantage of the change. And then, so there's a little bit of a dance sometimes with some of the...
Absolutely. Well, I have to do that dance with Meetup. And Meetup's not like a big channel for us, but it's a small one, but it's still one of them. But with them, I can only message a couple times a day to these event organizers. And so what I do is I Google their name, get their email address outside of the Meetup ecosystem. So then it's on my terms in Gmail, not on their terms in an internal dialogue messaging system. So then I can create these partnerships en masse anytime I want without being restricted by their API calls. So it's just little things like that you have to dance around.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the last thing you say is to optimize conversion at each step along the way. Again, this one's probably pretty obvious and basic, but what is it you teach there?
Yeah. So the main premise behind that is focus, and so it's if you're, and I think what we do in the workshop is actually focusing more on the homepage, because that's where that's the first place that someone lands. Mm-hmm. And so we'll talk about what are the sort of the best practices to convert somebody from the homepage to activation. So getting their email address or just getting to the next step in the funnel. Mm-hmm. And so it's in that sense, you're just what's the thing that you can focus on at a particular part of the funnel. Have you identified each part of the funnel? Do you know what's the step-by-step process in your product? What's the end goal? Mm-hmm. And typically there'll be one part of that funnel that's going to be the bottleneck, and putting your effort there. And then that bottleneck is typically the homepage. For most startups,
they just don't even get started on the right foot.
It's very common.
No, well, thank you for walking us through kind of all those things that you give in that presentation. That's great. Now, speaking of meetups, you're actually the organizer of the Enterprise Tech Meetup up in New York. So who is this meetup for, and why did you start it? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so started it when I first came out to New York, and I was very interested in the if you go to San Francisco right now, I think there's a lot of big companies with their core competency of technology. In New York, it's different. In New York, you don't have these really large companies that have technology as that core competency. And so in that case, they're more open to talking and having conversations with startups. Okay. I think that in some ways that most companies are an enterprise startup. Even as a company that's monetizing with ads, you're pitching sponsorships to a brand. You know, at the so the traditional like idea of this is a consumer company and this is a an enterprise B2B company. I think they kind of come together in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so the meetup is for entrepreneurs of all types, whether it's somebody that's in the consumer side that wants to learn a little bit more about how big businesses think, or it's also for investors. It's for people from these larger corporations. So we've had a lot of big companies come in to present and talk about what their interests are,
Mm-hmm.
and making those connections happen between the two.
Yeah.
So so I think the best way for it to happen is in person. But it's a way to bring in the startups as just a general statement. Startups have a problem, and they're trying to find and reach these decision makers at big companies. Executives at the same time are pressed for time, and it's difficult for them to vet startups. So the idea behind the meetup is, one of the products that I worked on, I wanted to position the product in a B2B way, and this is kind of how I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started it was a B2C product. It was one of the highest grossing finance apps at the time. It was called SEC Filings, and we said, hey, listen, maybe there's some opportunity to bring this B2B. And so I spent 3 months just reaching out to these guys. Was able to get a lot of senior level meetings, probably about a dozen executives, like CTO level type meetings. All of these guys, were interested in the product, but their timeline was just very different than our timeline.
So your timeline is now, theirs is next 6 months.
My time, yeah. Hey, let's do something. Next week. Hey, let's meet up again. But in this case, actually, most of them were like, hey, this is great. Let me help you out. Like next year, I have this thing that I really want to invite you to, and you're going to love it. And this is going to be perfect, and you're going to meet all these. And I'm like, all right, well, next year.
Yeah, well, let's do that. Right.
Yeah.
Next year, I'll be on to my 4th product from now.
Exactly, and so there's that inefficiency there that I had to learn how to reach out to these companies. I had to hustle.
Mm-hmm.
If I was able to talk to some of these companies a little bit earlier, I would have been more efficient about understanding what their needs were, and if those were immediate needs they were trying to handle, or if this was just something on their roadmap, starting next year.
Yeah.
So I think that's the idea behind the meetups there, and and it's going pretty well.
Yeah, that's great. Now, as you think about kind of the funnel that you've laid out for us, the lean marketing funnel, and the things you apply and the things you teach, how do enterprise companies apply those techniques as opposed to consumer-facing companies? Is there a difference in the way they approach the growth kind of problem, or is it really the same thing, just different words?
So I tend to think about growth is almost like sales on a massive scale. So the sale amounts are just smaller, and the decision is easier to make. Like me giving my email address, it's not that big of a deal, but it's still a sale. And
I gotcha.
And so to a larger company, I'm doing that in person, and the sale is a little bit more difficult. And if I were to maybe define what even like an enterprise sale is, or what even an enterprise company is,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say it's something where there's even more complexity, where you're dealing with multiple stakeholders. So on the web, you have one person clicking from one step to the next,
Mm-hmm.
where you also usually have usually the user knows what the problem is. With an enterprise company, the sale, you have to pitch multiple people, get them all on board with it, deal with all of their different motivations that they have. All the ones that we kind of talked about with virality are pretty
Mm-hmm.
similar. Status recognition, sex, all those sort of things. Maybe not as much sex, but whatever. So it's just a matter of how do you deal with these problems in person, and then how do you deal with these problems on the web. So So the way that I think about consumer, for example, is that it's you're making that immediate sale to one particular person, and with an enterprise, you're making it to multiple stakeholders.
Gotcha.
So in that case, kind of thinking about what are the things that you can use to persuade a group of people as opposed to a single person.
Yeah.
And so in that case, it becomes a lot of times inbound marketing, which is something that you see. So inbound marketing, producing content and getting people to sign up for your newsletter to get more content is an example of inbound, because it's you're not going out, you're to approach somebody, they're coming to you. That's a pretty good growth tactic that I think if you execute it well, can work in an interesting way.
Yeah.
Particularly, if you think about the enterprise company just having a much smaller market, like there's tons of people that could use Facebook. There's not so many people that are curious about Box in an enterprise sense.
Yeah.
Or using Atlassian or using Yammer. So the way to think about it is the sale process is just different. Tactics are different, but the lean marketing funnel is the same. It's just a matter of how what part of the funnel you're focusing on, and as a B2B company, or a B2C company, how can you use the best practices from both to make the types of sales that you're looking to do?
Now, you bring up a lot of good points about kind of the differences in the enterprise and the consumer, that at the heart, they have the same motivations, they're being moved through the same funnel, but there are differences. The market sizes are different, decision-making is different, multiple minds instead of one mind. There are nuances that if you don't really wrestle with, you're not going to be able to convert through that funnel very well, but it's still the same funnel we're talking about.
It's still the same funnel at the end of the day. I think in the future there's going to be more. I think you're starting to just take some of these like B2C tactics and starting to use them in the B2B world.
That's a good point.
And so like one example of that is the Yammer, the Salesforce APIs. So as a company, as a startup that's trying to sell to a lot of different businesses, you can start to think about these APIs and think about these consumer bases that some of these already somewhat established B2B companies have, and then using that as a way to get customers. And so those type of opportunities are just going to keep increasing. And if you're one of the first type of startups that is, let's say, the expense application at Yammer, then the customers that Yammer currently has are going to look at that and say, oh, this is the expense application, so maybe this is the one that I'm going to use. Whereas maybe in a couple of years from now, there's going to be like 10 of them, and it's going to be.
So what you're saying is, normally when we think about API integrations, we think about consumer. So I have a consumer product like a Zynga game, and I'm going to use a Facebook API to blast it out to as many people as possible. But now you can actually do that with B2B, because now Yammer has an API that no one's using, and if you want to latch onto that, you can be the first whatever in that platform, in that ecosystem. That's a great point.
It's just it's the idea of that what's that new channel that's out there. And so the one that I'm seeing right now is those B2B APIs, and I think there's going to be some people that take advantage of those.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, through your consulting and through your meetups, you're kind of surrounded by startups. I mean, my guess is every day, every week, you're seeing new startups. You're hearing all the cool things that people are doing, what they're not doing, all that stuff. In kind of your assessment, what do the growing startups have in common? Do you see any pattern matching there? Do you see any trends there? Is there anything we can be like, all right, growing startups usually do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, and that's partly a big part of my motivation for wanting to work with earlier stage companies. If there's different points of risk in a company that's new. So like the first stage is are you creating product value, and the second stage is then how do you go to market. And so the thing that's kind of in common with the enterprise and growth hacking is that step and figuring out how do you distribute. So I think the startups that have figured things out have figured out both of those two questions, which is one, do I have core product value, and two, have I figured out a way to distribute that? And so I think those are the ones that are most successful. At the end of the day, though, everyone has to have that core product value. And if you don't have that, figure that out first.
Yeah.
Or you're going to waste a lot of resources figuring out distribution when it's a little bit too early for that.
Yeah, I think we need to pause for a minute and think about what you just said, right? Because the two things you just brought up, I don't know if you can get more fundamental, right? Value, distribution. Like, that's it. Like, every funnel, every tactic, everything you've ever heard about any kind of marketing comes down to those two things: value and distributing that value. And if you don't do either of those, you completely lose 100%. Like, it isn't you do one or the other. Everything is about getting both of those right, and nothing else matters. I mean, is it that fundamental in your mind?
That's exactly how I think about it. If you can, from just an abstract level, if you can, figure out those two, if you can figure out the answers to those questions, I think you're going to be the successful startup. And all the other things at the same time, there's a lot of other things you can focus on. But if you can do those two things well, I think the other things are going to fall into place.
Yeah. That's another good point, is that if you have value, you can mess up in a lot of other ways.
Yes.
That's the thing. Here's the analogy that comes to my mind. It's a really dumb, corny, cheesy analogy. But if I had the winning lotto numbers and I mailed them to your house, but the only caveat is there's dog poop smeared all over them, but you can still read them, would you want them? Yes. Right? You would. Even though they smell, they're horrible, you would still want them, though, because the core value is there and they're being distributed to you, right?
I like that example.
It's a horrible analogy, but it's what comes to my mind. If you have the core value in the product and you can get it to somebody, it doesn't matter how disgusting or ridiculous everything else you do is.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is that how can you figure those things out at the lowest cost possible? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, you can make the promise first. You could say, this is what I want to do, and this is the value you're going to get. You could create an ad for it, and you could see if people are actually interested. And then you could spend more money on building out the product and optimizing the product and the flows in the product, and then actually build out a product. That all applies in the same way in enterprise. It applies also to consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. So given that you have seen a lot of startups, what's maybe the single best growth hack you've seen? Now, obviously, the world doesn't revolve around the one tactic that worked. We know that it's all about the whole funnel, it's about the conversion, it's about the ratios, it's about everything we talked about. But we got to still ask the fun question: what's the single best growth hack you've seen?
If we're gonna take the definition that growth hacking is sort of the best practices, tactics and best practices for user growth, and we're to kind of say that that you can expand this to enterprise and you can expand this to other types of companies. I think Meetup is an incredible growth hack.
How so? Talk to us about that.
So imagine you're trying to go after a senior executive at a big company. How do you get that senior executive's attention? It's difficult. They're pressed for time. There's a lot of other things they could be doing. They really don't want to work with you. You're not different than anybody else. But if you invite them to speak at something,
that's great. I like it already.
You appeal to so many people's motivations that maybe you're besides the job itself. You appeal maybe tangentially to the job. And so in terms of the amount of benefit you can get from bringing in a new big client from a big company, it's pretty significant. So I think one is events. It doesn't have to be a meetup. It could be a conference. Put on a conference or something. Get everyone in the same place, and then start to think about how you can make a sale.
Yeah. No, that's a really great insight there, and it reminds me of what we're doing with Growth Hacker TV. I mean, if you look at our list of guests, why would they come on here? Well, I'm appealing to their motivations at a very base level. Look, don't you want to educate? You're so smart. Don't you want to come on and be the star of the show? Don't you want to have the world revolve around you for an hour and let people immortalize you forever when it comes to growth? And well, yeah, I do want that. And they come on, and then there's a relationship there that I can build upon. But it started with really appealing to their motivations the way the Meetup hack does.
Yeah, and you're appealing to motivations that are similar to the motivations that you get on the web. It's the status recognition motivation. It's the the money stuff motivation, and so all of that comes into play. And whether it's you're making a pitch to somebody, in person, or if it's on the line.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I heard about raising venture capital, and it said, "If you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money."
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to happen, right? If you ask for advice, you're appealing to something so deep within them, they're probably going to want to fund you eventually if your idea is not horrible, if you're really just genuinely asking for insight. But if you just go and ask for money, they'll just give you a bunch of free advice because they don't want to invest.
And if you ask for advice, also someone's telling you what their needs are, and so once you know what someone's needs are, it's a lot easier to satisfy them.
Yeah, I'm starting to learn that you're about half a psychologist, aren't you?
I think all of this growth stuff is it's sales on a massive scale.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Understanding the motivations behind people, and then it's about being really efficient about delivering the value to somebody.
Absolutely. Well, this has been awesome, Conrad. One last question for you. What's the best advice you have for any startup that's trying to grow?
So, if I were to, let's see, one piece of advice, if I were to give one piece of advice,
Yeah, to sum it all up.
Let me think about this here. There's a couple different ways to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to pick one thing, and this is going to sound, maybe pretty corny, but it's going to be think a lot about your process. Think a lot about prioritization.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of startups are trying. I think there's two sides to it. One is implementing the tactics. Very important. You have to generate good ideas, and you have to those ideas have to come from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side of it is how quickly can you test those ideas out? I see a lot of startups make that problem where they're just not testing the ideas out fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they come asking for help, whereas they could have found a lot of what they're looking to do if they had just been able to create that process. So somebody that's already created a successful startup, they've experienced that process and they can replicate it somewhere else. And that's why they tend to be maybe a good investment, because you're like, well, they've experienced the process. It might be a different domain that you're investing in that particular entrepreneur. Let's say if you're like a VC or something.
Mm-hmm.
And as a startup marketer, I'm investing in people too,
Mm-hmm.
in a similar way. So how do you do you have that process down, and how quick are you?
Yeah, no, it seems like something you come back to, is that the framework, the process, the conceptual, philosophical understanding of what it is we're about and how we're going to do it and how we're going to do it quickly. And then all the tactics and initiatives and strategies will fit into that once you have this process really down.
Exactly. Bronson, you got it.
No, that's great. Well, Conrad, again, thank you so much for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Cool. I appreciate it. Thank you.